see that. But
Oh,
try to. It'll look
oh,
full
I
screen.
see. And then
It'll
you
look
see,
full screen here in a second.
oh,
It's too
okay.
much.
All right. I'll see.
Okay.
Oh, it's just too sweet. A lot of people are coming. No, no. Technical person.
All right. Okay.
Okay, we're ready to start. My story is one of too many examples of the horrific consequences when fear and hatred are used to divide people and the majority stand by and do nothing or collaborate. Anti-Semitism is fear and hatred of Jews, resulting in discrimination and persecution. It stems from the hate of communities and individuals, and not from what Jews do. The red stars on this map of France indicate some of the places mentioned in my story: Paris, Montignon, Veldiv, Drancy, Andrézy, Aix-les-Bains. I was 2 years old when Hitler marched into Paris, France on June 14, 1940. Why did I survive when powerful forces were bent on destroying all Jews? My parents, Cyril Lindenberg and Shlomo Zalman Hahn, were Jews born in Czechanów, Poland. My great aunt had prepared papers for them to immigrate to the US, but the borders in France closed before they could leave. If there had been less anti-Semitism in the US, perhaps my parents would have survived. Let me introduce you to some of my mother's family in Poland around 1936. My mother, Cyril, is in this picture. Yeshua Lindenberg, my grandfather with the beard, followed the old traditions. But the young people are dressed like anyone else in their community. I will speak more about my father later, Green Dot. Only my two aunts, Purple Dots, Rachel and Helen, survived Auschwitz. Even Shlonek, the little boy with a toy, was murdered. And Eliyahu, Orange Dot, was hung. His older brother, Herschel, a tailor, bribed the Germans with 2 free suits to have Eliyahu hung in another town so that my grandmother, Sarah Leah Lindenberg, would not have to witness the hanging. He was about 16 years old. Such murderous acts were repeated in many towns in Poland and elsewhere by Nazis and their willing accomplices. My parents moved to Paris around 1936 to join relatives and to seek a better life. I am 3.5 years old in my mother's arms. When the Germans entered Paris, my parents understood the danger. To save me, they put me in a children's home when I was about 3 years old, where my Jewish identity was hidden. There are about 29 toddlers in this picture at the children's home. I'm standing at attention, very rigid and most unhappy, but I am aware and amazed that the little girl on my left is arguing with a caregiver. I was much too scared to argue with anyone. At night, the children prayed to the statue of the Virgin Mary and giggled when I didn't know what to do. I was quickly taught, but I do not remember the prayers. I was confused and felt alone and abandoned. In this postcard dated September 6, 1941, my mother writes in Polish to her family how painful it is for her to leave me each time she visits the children's home. Because I would cry wanting to go home with her, she was asked to visit only weekly. I do not remember her visits. As a mother, it broke my heart to feel my mother's pain and agony at leaving her child with strangers, hoping I would be safe and that someday life would be sane again and we could be reunited as a family. The Germans moved slowly at first in imposing what they called racial laws. Hitler fed on Europe's long history of anti-Semitism to inflame and unite his followers. He skillfully used propaganda, as in this poster, that portrays the Jew as a dangerous enemy. Nazis depicted Jews as subhuman and inferior and blamed them for all the world's problems. Germans were considered the superior Aryan race, outrageous lies that unfortunately too many people chose to believe. Race is a false construct created by oppressors to justify inhumane treatment. This baby picture of Hesse Levinson Taft was used in Nazi propaganda to portray the ideal Aryan baby. The Nazis never discovered that their perfect Aryan baby was in fact Jewish. The photographer wanted to ridicule the Nazis. And although the Nazis were ridiculous and the superiority of the Aryan race is nonsense, their propaganda was nevertheless very successful. The first anti-Semitic law the Nazis imposed in France was that all Jews had to register with the police. Only 10% disobeyed. Many could have hidden their identities because religion was no longer part of the French census. These registration forms were later used to round up Jews. Then anti-Semitic laws, what the Nazis called racial laws, came so quickly there was no time to digest or know them all. The aim was to isolate Jews, exclude them from all social and civic life, so there would be no protest when they were deported. On May 29, 1942, almost 2 years after the Germans had invaded France, Jews had to wear yellow stars. They lost their citizenship and no longer had any protection. To hide a Jew could cost you your life. In the beginning, it was mostly men and women who were rounded up. Intellectual, political, and religious leaders, the wealthy, communists, Romas, Jehovah's Witnesses, homosexuals, the disabled, anyone whom the Nazis deemed undesirable or were needed as workers. The final solution, whose aim was to exterminate all Jews, was decided in autumn 1941 and implemented January 1942. Taliana de Rosnay, in her book Sarah's Key, provides a powerful description of La Grande Rave, the big roundup. Early on the morning of July 16, 1942, in addition to men, women and children were rounded up, wrenched from their beds. The Nazis had only asked for the adults, but the Vichy government, the puppet government in the south of France, in their anti-Semitic fervor, also rounded up the children. Women without children were sent to the detention camp Drancy near Paris. That is where my mother was sent. Women with children were sent to the Velodrome d'Hiver, an indoor stadium. Conditions were horrendous. The Germans would not alter the train schedules to Auschwitz to accommodate the children, so the French police brutally separated the children from their mothers. The children were left alone to fend for themselves until they too were deported and sent directly to the gas chambers. If my parents had not sent me away, I could easily have been one of these children. The ordinary French citizen had been indifferent, but these roundups generated sympathy. Most Jews who survived in France had at least one Christian family to thank. My mother was deported from Camp Drancy on Convoy 11 on July 27, 1942. Of the 1,000 Jews on Convoy 11, only 13 were alive 3 years later.
My mother was 28 years old when she was murdered. I was 4 years old. There is so much I do not know about her. What she liked, what her dreams were, how she felt about leaving her parents, how she met my dad. So many questions I did not think to ask her two sisters who survived.
When it was no longer safe for me to be in the children's home, my father, who was fighting with the French resistance, arranged for me to be placed with a Catholic family on a farm. There were about 10 children plus their own. The family ate at a separate table. I was so jealous. I wanted so much to belong, to be with my own family. I don't know if they knew I was Jewish. At this age, I didn't know I was Jewish. I was miserable, even more lonely and unhappy. I stayed on this farm for the rest of the war, about 2 or 3 years. Paris was officially liberated on August 25, 1944. 76,000 French Jews perished. 70% were foreign-born like my mother. After the war, I was taken to an orphanage in Andrézy. I started public school and needed tutoring, another consequence of the war. At Christmas, I got a beautiful doll dressed in a black cape lined in pink satin. In the summer, we were told to pack our bags, but to leave our toys behind. The toys would be here when we returned, but I never returned to this orphanage and never saw my beautiful doll again, though I wrote and pleaded to get her back. I had no doll and no parents. After the war, I remember visiting my father twice in the hospital. I was so excited to see him and very optimistic about his recovery. But on my last visit, he told me he was dying and that his end would bring me to the US and take care of me. I was 7 years old. This picture was sent to the family in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, so they could recognize me. I was told of my father's death and promptly blocked it out of my mind. One evening in bed at the orphanage, the children were discussing the future. I said my father would come to get me as soon as he felt better. One child said my father was dead. I denied it. She insisted. I got hysterical. My father was the son of very poor parents. He was a tailor, a common occupation for many Jewish immigrants in Paris. In this Yizkor book of Jews who perished in the Holocaust from Chechanov, Poland, the writer says my father dreamt of a better world from an early age. He fought the fascist government in Poland and was imprisoned. When the Nazis occupied Paris, he joined the French resistance, despite his poor health. He was wounded, hospitalized, and died of tuberculosis before his 36th birthday. 2.5 years later, his remains were transferred from a pauper's plot to a Holocaust Heroes Memorial in the Bagno Cemetery. My last orphanage was a Jewish orphanage in Aix-les-Bains, where I learned a few Yiddish words and a little more about being Jewish. Friends of my father gave me the doll I am holding, my very own doll that I still have today. Here I am peering out of the porthole of the ship Sobieski with my doll Juliet in New York on June 7th, 1948. I was the youngest in a group of about 20 refugees brought here by the Hayas, the Hebrew Immigration Aid Society, an organization that started helping Jewish refugees more than a century ago and now helps refugees of every religion, ethnicity, and nationality. So now at age 10, I am about to venture into the next phase of my life, about my 7th move so far, closing a period of chaos and danger. My great aunt and uncle, Jacob and Rose Schlesinger, went to great effort with the Hayas to bring me here. It took more than 2 years. They spoke no French, so we did not have a common language. Soon upon my arrival in Philadelphia, my family started to call me Frances instead of Fanny, my birth name. And I thought it was because I came from France, so I called them American. When I first came to America, I still hoped my father would find me, even though rationally I knew he was dead. I had to finally acknowledge his death when I was adopted 2 years later by my great aunt and uncle. I felt disloyal when my last name was changed. With a new family, everyone, including myself, expected me to be happy and to forget my past, but I couldn't forget. Now that I am a senior citizen, my memory has faded, so I'm glad I wrote my story. I wish I had started at age 10, but people generally did not want to speak about the Holocaust at that time. I became a US citizen at age 15, earned a BA at Temple University in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and married Ken Cutler in 1968. By then, I understood and acknowledged Fanny's anger and rage at feeling abandoned, and came to appreciate my parents' courage, the danger to those who helped and hid me, and the kindness and generosity of my adopted parents. They already were grandparents when they undertook the task of raising a traumatized, angry 10-year-old. They gave me the family I so desperately wanted and were grandparents to my daughter. Most children of survivors did not have living grandparents. This is my daughter, Cynthia, and she's here in person at her bar mitzvah in Willingboro, New Jersey, with me and my late husband. We moved to Miami in 1985, where I worked at the University of Miami, earned an MA in Liberal Studies, and studied the Holocaust. In Miami, I joined a Holocaust child survivors group, which was very healing. To celebrate the group's 13th birthday, we published the book, Children Who Survived the Final Solution. And my story is one of 26 in this book. Widowed and retired, I moved to Nashville 20 years ago to live near my daughter. After being widowed for 7 years, I met George Hahn, and we were married a year later. George and I traveled to Israel in February 2011. This memorial at Yad Vashem remembers the 1.5 million Jewish children whose lives were brutally terminated in the Holocaust. Many could have been saved. I survived because people cared and acted, and I was incredibly lucky. 11,000 children in France did not survive. Despite a traumatic childhood, I have had great joys in my life. But recent anti-Semitic events have shaken me and made me feel less safe. The killing of Heather Heyer, swastikas, and shouts against Jews at a Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville, Virginia in 2017 were very upsetting. For the first time since arriving in the US, I wondered where could I flee. 6 million Jewish men, women, and children were systematically murdered during the Holocaust. The hatred that led to the Holocaust over 80 years ago, unfortunately, is still happening today. We witnessed this on January 6, 2021, when our capital was violently assaulted by a mob, some wearing T-shirts with the code 6MWE. 6 million was not enough. Others wore Camp Auschwitz hoodies, carried Confederate flags and other symbols of white supremacy and conspiracy theories. This attack on our government was frightening. It used to be that anti-Semitism was politically incorrect and flourished on the underground. But now the number of hate crimes has increased dramatically, including in our own neighborhoods here in Nashville. It's important to remember anti-Semitism is not just dangerous for Jews. It may begin with hatred toward Jews, but it does not end there. During COVID, to celebrate George's 90th birthday, we started a GoFundMe to build a statue on the grounds of Congregation Micah in memory of the children of the Shoah, the Holocaust. Teresa Dyer, the sculptor, copied the little suitcase that I carried from France, a suitcase from my father with many of the pictures used in this presentation. This statue was dedicated on Sunday, April 10th. George was very ill, but he gave an excellent speech, and we celebrated our 13th wedding anniversary in the hospital. George died on June 27, 2022, almost 92 years old. I share my story to remind all of us to speak out when we encounter hate and to work with others to create a society where everyone can flourish, a world where our differences are celebrated and protected. Thank you very much. Oh, thank you. Thank you. That's beautiful.
I want to thank my dear friend, Frances, and her daughter, Cynthia, to come today to tell such a difficult story because I felt it was important in the day and age that we're living in. Thank you all for coming today.
She's stronger than she looks, and she's happy to answer any questions that you might have.
What did you say? Oh, okay. The questions are good. So if you, I know I made you very sad. It made me very sad. I usually have been in the past able to tell my story and very seldom to cry, but it's getting harder. So. Yes. I'm glad she's here. So the question was, who will continue the stories after we're gone? And what I said was our children, and that it's already happening. The children are already doing that. And that there's very few survivors left, including child survivors and certainly adult survivors. There's a few adult survivors left in Nashville, but they're not sharing their stories.
Is something that, because of the love of the Father, was able to do this.
Yes. I hadn't thought about how I was thinking it was not appropriate for me to speak on Father's Day, that you might want something more cheery. But yes, certainly the love of my father and his taking care of making sure I would be safe, and my mother as well. But he continued after she died. Yeah. So that it's an appropriate commemoration of my father. Yes.
Your grandparents who raised you, I'm sorry, it was your aunt?
My great aunt and uncle.
Your great aunt
Yes.
and uncle. Did you have a lot of time with them? Did they live a long life?
Yes, they lived. I was 40 years old when my great aunt died, my adopted mother. And a couple years later, my adopted father died. So that was actually the longest relationship I had had at that time. And my adopted mother's death was very difficult for me to handle because it rummaged up a lot of other deaths. It was a different stage in my life to deal with. One of the difficult deaths I had to deal with before then was my Aunt Helen's death. And my two aunts had immigrated to Toronto, Canada. And my Aunt Helen was killed by a car when she was 37 years old, and she had two children, 10 years old and 7 years old. That was a difficult death to handle. I was about 20 years old, almost 20, when that happened. And that was very difficult. Mm-hmm.
Was it later research or?
The question, how did I learn about my mother's death? So when I was in Miami and joined a child survivors group, other told me they were getting this kind of information from the American Red Cross at that time. Now you would get it from the US Holocaust Museum. So I wrote to them, and it took a while to get the information and didn't come in one piece of information. There were about 3 letters. And they researched the German records, and I included in my presentation, in case any Holocaust deniers might attend, because the documentation of the Holocaust is very voluminous. And that's one, there it is in black and white. what convoy she was in. And, you know, so that's one instance, just one instance of so many Jews who perished that way. But it did take, it takes an effort, it takes an action to get the information. You know, you have to go get it, find it. But it's available, yeah. Part of the problem is some of the documentations, like in the Ukraine and Russia, it was not as available, it became more available, and now there's some concern some of it may be destroyed. Mhm. Have I been able to trace any family in Europe or in Israel who survived? Yeah, some of my father's family did survive. Some are in Israel, and I met some of them when they came to visit. Oh, okay. So who survived on my mother's side? Two aunts. They have children, and they have children, and they have children. So, oh, I didn't have my 80th picture. Oh, and one cousin. I'm so sorry. I forgot about my cousin Jean. His story is very similar to mine. His parents did not survive. He survived in France. When my parents went to France, there were already two sisters there. One sister went back to Poland to marry her fiance and did not survive. My cousin Jean's parents did not survive, but he survived by being with a family in a village, Convalt? A little village right outside Paris with the Nadeau family, who a Christian family, and he used to go there in the summer, and he finally got that family awarded a Righteous Gentile award by the government of Israel. Do I need to explain that, or? He came to the US when he was about 14 years old and lived in Chicago with his aunt on his father's side, but went back, got his education here, a master's in chemistry, served in the American Army, and then decided to go back to France because he felt too French. I never wanted to go back. Although I love the French language, I think it's beautiful, but I didn't have positive memories. He had much more. He was a little older than me. He was about 8 years old. And for a long time, he did not delve into his background, but on his 80th birthday, which is about 10 years ago, he started reading letters that his parents had sent him and was devastating. And he and his family retraced the route that his parents took to escape, but they were not successful through Spain and the Alps. So that's another very interesting story. Yeah. If I understand you, what are the similarities between Germany in terms of who is speaking out against anti-Semitism? So the parallels happened very early. It didn't just happen here. I mean, currently, when political leaders start pitting one group of people against another group and vilifying another group, those are red flags and very dangerous red flags. And I saw them right away. Not everybody saw them right away. And now it's very evident and very dangerous. And I'm just hoping, as I was telling Guy Griffith, that I hope our legal system will work and make people accountable who break laws, no matter who they are. So I hope that answers your question. Yeah. Anyone else? Well, thank you so much for coming. I really appreciate your being here. Okay. Oh, you're welcome.